Welcome to Biology for You. In this video, we are going to discuss C-value paradox. In the series of videos, we have been discussing different concepts in molecular biology. So in this video, we are going to have the basic idea of the C-value paradox. So coming to the first point, what exactly is the C-value is? So first we learned that C-value to understand what is a paradox here. So coming to that point, here the C-value is nothing but the content of DNA present in the haploid genome of an organism. So it is the DNA content present in the haploid genome of an organism. So this term C value here, C may be indicating the term characteristic value or maybe complement or maybe content, simply the content of the DNA. So this indicates the C value indicates the content of the DNA present in the haploid genome of an organism. So this term C value proposed by scientists named Hughes and Swift. So basically the scientists observed that the C value, that means that the content of the DNA will be increasing with the complexity of the organism. That means if you consider primitive organisms like E. coli, the DNA content will be less, and as the complexity of the organism increases, the complex genetic content or the C value or the content of the DNA will also be increases. So that is actually the C value should follow. That means the C value should be increasing with the increase in the complexity of an organism. So from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, it is exactly the same. But the paradox comes when you compare different species of the eukaryotes. So scientists extracted DNA from different species and they plot a graph and they compared the genetic content or DNA content present in different species of an species, and they observed there is a paradox. That means it is not always true that the genetic content of the C value is increasing with the increasing the complexity of the organism. So it is mostly in the case of eukaryotes. So in prokaryotes to eukaryotes, it is following the order. That means if you take a graph, so here the lower C values indicated by the E. coli or some of the prokaryotes. So here the higher eukaryotes like human being having higher C values. So, but if you compare C values among vertebrates or maybe higher eukaryotes, we will get this paradox. It is not always true that the DNA content will be increasing with the increasing the complexity. So here, if you take an examples like algae, some molluscans, and insects, fish, and amphibians, some flowering plants. So it is the actual order, type of order it is showing, but we expect amphibians are lesser complex organisms than human. So what we think the DNA content will also be lesser in the amphibians than the human, but that is not true. So that is what the C value paradox is. C value paradox describes the describes how it is deviating from the order, how the genetic content in the haploid genome is deviating from the order. So it's supposed to be here amphibians supposed to be lesser uh, complex. That means they must have lesser genetic content or C value, but it is not true. So some of the amphibians like salamander having 40 times 40 times higher than the human beings in its C value. So this is one of the example. So where the C value paradox is predominant. And let us consider another example of the sunflowers. Helianthus. This Helianthus having 4 times higher C value than its relatives. So within the same genera, we have C value paradox. That means between the related species, we also observe very much deviation in the C value. And even we can also consider another example in which Drosophila there is having higher C value than the Drosophila mellangusta. So in the same genre also we can observe drastic change in the C value. So this is what the C value paradox is. And basically why it is happening is it is actually no more paradox in this time. That means this is mostly resolved and understood why it is happening. So there are basically different theories to understand why it is happening. During the year of 1970 to 1980, like that, they discovered non-coding DNA. So here, this non-coding, there are some coding portion of DNA, and there is some non-coding portion in the DNA. They discovered this non-coding portion of the DNA, and simply they understood that C value paradox is happening with the non-coding portion of the DNA, but not the coding portion of the DNA. This coding portion of the DNA is following the order. That means as the complexity increases, the coding portion of the DNA is also increasing. But it is not the case in non-coding portion of the DNAs. So here the C value paradox is mostly resolved with the discovery of the non-coding DNA. So here the other term C value enigma was proposed. The C value enigma describes the differences between the non-coding portions of the DNA of the organisms. So coming to the what are the different concepts behind this C value paradox, that means how it is resolved. As we already discussed, due to the non-coding portion of the DNA, C value paradox is happening. That means we have junk DNA, something called junk DNA, which is not useful for the production of the proteins. So it is not the expressive part of the DNA. So this C value paradox is happening because of this non-coding or junk DNA. So here the coding portion or coding DNA is following this C value order. As the complexity increases, the coding portion of the DNA will also be increased. But as the complexity of the organism increases, the non-coding portion may not always follow the order. Here, Basically, mm, it indicates presence of introns, regulatory sequences, intergenes, um, and pseudogenes, and the multiple copies of the genes, multiple copies of the sequences. So that means repetitive DNA. So, so these kind of sequences will be appeared and they spread all over the genome. So they are responsible. Uh, it is the characteristic feature of this species. That means how much junk DNA should be present in an organism, how many introns, how much the amount of DNA should be present in between genes, how much the length of the regulatory sequences. All these are the characteristics of an organism. That means all these are selected during the evolution of an organism. So the natural selection favors some of the C content. That means uh, for an organism, this natural selection favors the amount of the DNA suitable for it. So uh, all this length of these sequences, this type of non-coding portion of the DNA will be decided by the uh, natural selection of an organism during its evolution. So that is the answer for the C value paradox. If you consider the metabolism and the mRNA content, so the coding portion is expressed through this mRNA, and if you consider these content, it is following the order. That means in similar species or maybe in related species in the same division, these are having mostly similar content, similar amount of the mRNA, and also they have similar metabolic patterns. So it is following the sequential order. So coming to the other point, basically this uh, C value paradox is also happening um, with the karyotypes and nucleotypes of an organism. That means here uh, the DNA content will decide its chromosome organization. That means, uh, the size of the chromosomes and the number and their karyotypes. So uh, these kind of things will be decided by the content of the DNA, which is in the non-coding part of the DNA. That means as the uh, complexity increases, the coding portion will be the same, but non-coding portion may not the same as increases with the complexity of an organism. That is characteristic feature of the organism or the species, and here it will decide the content of the DNA will decide uh, the uh, the lengths of these different sequences will decides the number of chromosomes and their sizes and their karyotypes and all. So that is also a explanation for the C value paradox. So coming to the next point, basically this C content, DNA content will decides the cell size of the nucleus and the time taken for the cell division. So these three things are also dependent on the C value or the genetic complement of a haploid organism. So these are the another explanations. That means as the genetic content increases, the cell size increases, nucleus size of the nucleus increases, time taken for the cell is also increases, which are all of the characteristic features of an organism. So these are the explanations for the C-value paradox. So that is why the C-value is deviating even in the related species, or even uh, in the species which are not following the sequential order. So that is why C value is deviating, and it is not following the sequential order with the complexity of an organism, because it's all about the characteristic features of the species of an species or an organism. So due to the presence of non-coding portion of the DNA, due to presence of different lengths of different sequences present in the DNA in among these species, mm, this C value is happening, but their metabolism is mostly the similar with similar species, and the mRNA content is mostly more or less the same. And this is deciding the C value differences will decide the size, number, and karyotype of the chromosome. That means the segregation of the genes will be decided by the C value. And also the cell size, nuclear size, and the time taken for the cell division will also be decided by the C content of an organism. So this is all about the C value paradox, and this is actually only for the namesake. The C paradox is here, but it is already dissolved after the discovery of these non-coding sequences. So this is all about the C value paradox. Uh, Hope you understand this video. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel.